I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. We've all heard this one, right? It's usually attributed to the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire, and it is pretty much considered the ultimate badge of intellectual bravery. It paints this heroic picture of a society where free speech is so vital, so absolutely crucial, that you'd actually risk your life to protect it. People use it all the time to set the stage in political debates, basically offering to throw themselves on a metaphorical grenade just to protect an opponent's right to speak. But here's the kicker. Voltaire never actually said it. Seriously, no way. The phrase was actually coined more than a century after his death by a historian who was just paraphrasing his general attitude. And according to author Jonah Goldberg, even that attitude wasn't exactly sincere. The quote actually traces back to this massive public hullabaloo over a book by a philosopher named Helvetius. Now, Voltaire actually hated the book, but the Second Parliament banned it and became this huge public sensation. Well, Voltaire suddenly changed his tune to jump on the fashionable bandwagon. Goldberg points out that this whole expression was really born in glibness and vanity, not courage. It's kind of just a way to earn bravery on the cheap. And that introduces the core theme of our explainer today, how we use clichés as placeholders for arguments we haven't actually won. Here's another one you hear literally all the time. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Goldberg argues that this is the ultimate thought-terminating cliché. It's specifically used to end an argument without, actually making one. By casually tossing this phrase into a debate, the speaker is basically suggesting that because people argue over labels, it's therefore totally impossible to make meaningful moral distinctions. The author draws on G.K. Chesterton here, who made this brilliant point. If a man shoots his grandmother at 500 yards, he's a good shot, sure, but not necessarily a good man. Means and ends actually matter. Claiming they don't is just a rhetorical trick. So let's really dive into this. Welcome to this explainer of Jonah Goldberg's book, The Tyranny of Clichés, How Liberals Cheat in the War of Ideas. We're going to put on a neutral analytical lens today to explore the author's central thesis, which is that throughout modern politics, specific language, buzzwords, and clichés are constantly deployed to mask deeply held ideologies. We're going to see how politicians and pundits claim to be completely non-ideological, all while using these exact clichés to smuggle their worldview right past our critical radar. Section 1. The myth of the center. Is the middle always right? Think about how we talk about the middle in modern politics. The author notes how centrists, moderates, and independents are almost universally treated like they hold the moral high ground. They're seen as somehow more sophisticated and mature than those straight-line thinkers on the left or the right. But Goldberg uses this wild bridge analogy to illustrate why he thinks the center isn't always correct. Imagine two people are arguing over a 100-foot chasm. One person, let's call them an extremist, says we need a 100-foot bridge to cross it. Another extremist says we don't need a bridge at all because we shouldn't cross the chasm. Then, a centrist walks up and insists that we compromise by building a 50-foot bridge. The result? You just fall straight into thin air. The book argues that sometimes one extreme is 100% correct, and the centrist position is just completely disastrous. Splitting the difference isn't automatically the superior strategy. So where did we even get this idea that the center is so privileged? Well, we often hear the story of Galileo and the Catholic Church. Modern lore says the Church just couldn't handle humanity being dethroned from the center of the universe. But the author argues this history is exactly backward. To the pre-Copernican medieval mind, the center was definitely not a place of privilege. According to thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Dante, the center was the lowest, filthiest, most material part of the universe. The heavens were up above, and all the coarse, heavy stuff just naturally sank down to the center. So sticking to the old scientific paradigm wasn't about human arrogance at all. It was actually about humility. Our modern bias completely misinterprets this history just to artificially elevate the center. Section 2. The disguise of pragmatism. We just want what works. The book's argument here is that politicians routinely disguise their ideological goals by claiming they're just being rational pragmatists. They set themselves up as cool empiricists just following the data, while labeling anyone who disagrees with them as a crazy, stubborn ideologue. Take this quote from Barack Obama's inaugural address. The question we ask today is not whether our government is too big or too small, but whether it works. Analyzing this objectively, Goldberg illustrates how this is a classic rhetorical strategy. It frames the speaker's own preferences as objective, empirical facts. But if you really think about it, what works is entirely subjective. If you want Mexican food for lunch and your friend wants Chinese, you both want what works for your own preferences. Deciding what is right for the times is an inescapably ideological process. So the crucial point is how we define this big, scary word ideology. The author suggests looking at the German synonym, Weltanschauung, which translates simply to a worldview. An ideology isn't some mental zombie virus or an elaborate rationalization for bigotry. It's just a basic checklist of ideas and principles you use to evaluate reality. Literally everyone has one. It's the essential framework that helps a person distinguish the important from the unimportant. Having an ideology just means you've come to some conclusions about how the world works. Section 3. The Healthcare Debate, Data or Dogma. To really test this idea of pragmatism versus ideology, Goldberg takes us into the healthcare debate, specifically looking at the famous World Health Organization's rankings. These are cited all the time to argue that the American system is inferior to European systems. But take a look at how the actual methodology of that study breaks down. A massive 66% of a healthcare system score was based on financial fairness, which essentially measures how socialized the system is and how costs are redistributed. The actual health outcomes, things like survival rates and medical success, accounted for only 25% of the score. The author points this out to show that the study primarily measured alignment with a very specific political ideal, not actual medical excellence. The data itself literally had a built-in ideological bias. Furthermore, we often hear that life expectancy data proves the failure of certain health systems. But Goldberg highlights this incredibly surprising statistic. Asian American women have an average life expectancy of 87 years. That is actually higher than the overall average in Japan, which is the longest living national group in the world. Meanwhile, other demographics in America have drastically lower life expectancies. This demonstrates that cultural choices, demographics, and localized factors impact health data massively. And they do it entirely independently of the government healthcare system. For Goldberg, this proves that just wielding numbers like stage props doesn't magically make an argument purely empirical. Section 4. The Invention of the Ideologue, a brief history of an insult. So how exactly did ideologue become such a dirty word? Why do politicians run from it like the plague? Let's trace the history and see how this built up over time. Back in 1796, during the French Enlightenment, a thinker named Destutt de Tracy coined ideology, simply as the science of ideas. It was originally meant to be a branch of psychology. But by 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power. When Tracy and his fellow free-market thinkers stood by their principles and opposed Napoleon's absolute rule, well, Napoleon weaponized the term. He used ideologue as an insult to dismiss his critics, framing them as out-of-touch dreamers getting in the way of his intensely practical administration. Later on, Karl Marx argued that ideology was just a false consciousness forced on you by your social class. And finally, American pragmatism emerged, focusing solely on, you guessed it, what. And this brings us right back to the core argument of the book, which is captured perfectly by its cover art showing the strings of a puppet. The author argues that modern claims of pragmatism, that constant refrain of we just want what works, are used today exactly how Napoleon used them centuries ago. It's a rhetorical trick. It's used to dismiss principled opponents as dreamers or extremists, which then allows the speaker to claim total authority over the facts. Section 5. The moral equivalent of war. Mobilizing the masses. If you claim to just be a pragmatist looking for what works, well, history kind of shows that war definitely works. War gets people to drop their private interests, follow orders, and work together like nothing else. But obviously, actual war is incredibly destructive. So American philosopher William James searched for a way to harness that unifying power of war without the actual bloodshed, and he coined the phrase, the moral equivalent of war. This metaphor essentially became a blueprint. Woodrow Wilson used actual war socialism in World War I. Then FDR explicitly framed the New Deal as a continuation of that exact wartime mobilization. Lyndon B. Johnson launched the war on poverty. And today we hear about the green energy crusade, fighting climate change as if it's literally World War II. The author points out that this highly pragmatic concept was eagerly adopted to rally society, bypass normal debate, and justify vast expansions of state power, all under the guise of an absolute emergency. Which brings us to the author's central summarizing takeaway. As quoted directly from the text, pragmatism is the disguise progressives and other ideologues don when they want to demonize competing ideologies. According to the book, when someone tells you they have no ideology, that they just want what works, they are using a cliché to shut down the debate. The author argues they absolutely do have an ideology. They just don't want to argue about it on an even playing field. So I really want to leave you with this provocative thought. The next time someone on the news or even just in a debate with a friend claims they are just being pragmatic, are they really? Or are they just hiding their ideology behind a socially acceptable cliché? By unpacking these phrases, we can start to actually see the invisible strings of rhetoric that shape our political world.
Keep your radar up and always look past the cliché to the actual ideas underneath.